Thank you. Last but not least, marine net gain. Simple. Right, let's crack into it. So I'm here from Natural England. My colleague Jess Bone is here as well from the team that work on marine net gain projects within Eddy. We also have Lucy from DEFRA, Lucy Runciman from the DEFRA net gain team. So I'm just here to very quickly run through some very big projects. So I'm going to try and keep it short, but this is kind of the tip of the iceberg. We do have some QR codes though on all of these, well, not all of the slides, but a critical point. So I think you can scan them with your phone as I go through the presentation, and we'll put one up at the end as well. Okay, so what is net gain? I think it means different things to different people, but essentially it's an approach to development that leaves the environment in a better state than before. At least that's the idea. So the Environment Act introduced biodiversity net gain on land to the main terrestrial planning regimes. But marine net gain, so that's beyond the subtidal, does have cross-government support under the EIP to develop an approach to marine net gain that's appropriate to the marine environment. So not necessarily just duplicating BNG and the BNG metric necessarily, but trying to design something that actually works and gets us gains. So the way I like to sort of think about net gain, if we follow the mitigation hierarchy, that's central to net gain, both on land and within the proposed marine net gain policy as it stands. So it's all about trying to avoid impacts, minimising impacts where they're going to occur, mitigating any impacts that do occur, and then offsetting any of the residual impact. And then the net gain is what we sometimes refer to as the sort of cherry on top, if you like. So it's going from conservation through to recovery. And if we pool our resources around that cherry on top, there's a potential route through to getting at-scale recovery and restoration. And that's the exciting bit, I think. It's a sort of a new way of working, I think. We did have a consultation from government on the high-level principles of net gain back in 2022, and that concluded with a government response in 2023, which sets out the definitions as they stand for those high-level principles that we're working towards, and some of the responses, obviously, that came into that. But I think it's fair to say there was broad support, at least for the concepts across the marine sector as a whole, including industry. Okay, so there's a lot to be done across the DEFRA sort of family and working with stakeholders. All of these things are not simple, and neither are any of them. Primarily, I think Natural England would be fair to say that we're working primarily on the ecological evidence side, but working a lot with partners, and we'll look at some of those projects in a second, and also on the assessment frameworks that will underpin, ultimately, some kind of tool or calculation to be able to measurably demonstrate that gains are being delivered. But there's lots of other stuff that DEFRA is working on through a variety of projects, but I'm not going to cover those today. The only thing I will mention, just in passing, because it has come up quite a lot, I think, is this idea of pilots. So for marine net gain, pilots we think are going to be essential. We need to run pilots to work out what's possible ecologically, what's possible with the current legislation that we've got, what are the blockers, what's the leasing framework look like, is that going to be something that we can use or adapt to try and deliver gains at sea. So we are currently setting up some pilot projects, but they're not quite ready to sort of talk about just yet. So we'll focus on some of the other Natural England evidence projects. So as I say, there's lots of novel research evidence needed for DEFRA to be able to develop the policy and also to look forward to implementation. And we're leading on some of these, particularly given our experience with biodiversity net gain on land, which goes down to the intertidal. So we do have that experience and that precedent. So the first project I'm going to talk about, and again, use the QR codes because I'm not an expert on this project by any means. This is led by our colleague, Charlotte Johnston, is the Marine Restoration Potential Project, or MAREPO. So there are some publications already out for this. They're being revised at the moment, but that project is nominally complete. It was a proof of concept study to map the restoration potential of some of England's threatened and declining marine habitats. So it's really just to test if this is even possible to start to identify some of the habitats that might be restorable in England waters and how sensible or how likely that would be. That was to supply evidence to support Natural England and DEFRA's work programmes, both on marine net gain, but also for other areas of work like compensation, and it was delivered by Eddy through the Offshore Wind Enabling Actions Programme. So we looked at those habitats on the screen. I won't read them out. And just trying to see where some of those declining priority habitats would be most likely to succeed if restoration measures were taken. So we came up with this, and again, this is being revised at the moment, so don't forward this on to anybody yet, but it'll be online in its revised format shortly. But you can sort of see it was taking this approach to those 5 habitats to look at sort of suitability, substrate, that kind of thing, around the coast by plan area. There are different units used, I'm told, where data has dictated that different unit approaches need to be taken. But it's starting to get to the nitty-gritty of what is actually possible here if we just crack on and do it. And this has gone down really well with industry, certainly at the SUDG level, because they're looking for these things. You know, we talked earlier about commercial bodies looking for ways they can actually do something. They constantly come to us and say, well, what can we do? What can we put in that's going to be a gain? And of course we say, well, we're not entirely sure. So it's working on these evidence projects to try and provide some kind of answer to that question. Now we're into MyRepo Plus. So this is the next stage of the project. I'll just put them all up now. So we're looking into things like historical extents of habitats. That's not necessarily a baseline that we need to revert to, as other speakers have said, but it's a potential guide for decision making. We're developing the habitat models themselves, but we're also mapping constraints for restoration. So there might be hard constraints that we can't change, that means that habitats might not be so suitable for restoration in certain places. And then also, similarly to the Rememory project, which you might be familiar with in England, that's EA-led, we're looking at habitat restoration handbooks. Can we create those? And also, we'll just go back, also looking at species as well. So the previous MyRepo project was much more based around habitats, but we're looking at whether we can widen that out and look at sort of species population levels that we could, at the species population level, and do something there. The next project, briefly, is the Marine Irreplaceable Habitats Project, or MIH. We have a publication out on that as well, all accessible via those QR codes I mentioned. And that is looking to mirror what was done on land as part of the National Planning Policy Framework, which required a list of which terrestrial and coastal habitats are irreplaceable as part of that. We don't have the same thing at sea, but we could see it on the horizon as being really important for net gain. So in net gain terms, certainly for BNG, you can't deliver gains for an irreplaceable habitat. It doesn't make sense. If you can't replace it, you can't, somehow try and replace it and get a gain. For marine, though, we worked with the MBA to work up a draft definition of irreplaceability. It's probably a new word, I don't know. And came up with a report which you can access here. So generally, they're very difficult to restore, very slow to recover. They may be nationally rare, or have an unusual or rare environmental context. So it's starting to look into that. Now we're mapping the irreplaceable habitats to try and come up with a heat map, so based on habitat mapping that we already have, and then overlaying that with a filter of irreplaceability. Important thing to say about this, though, for marine, it's not a binary, it's irreplaceable, it's not irreplaceable. It's much more of a threshold. So we'll get into that when the policy develops, I think, on what that means in practice and implementation. So we're working on this at the moment. I think it hopefully should be out fairly soon as a data layer, but we do have some licensing issues generally, which seems to be something that we're always fighting with. And then lastly, on the project side of things, this is one of the projects I'm working on. So this is the Marine Net Gain Assessment Frameworks project. So how much gain do you need to deliver, and what does it look like over your development impact to be able to say we've got a gain? Because the obvious thing here is if a developer says, well, we've done this nice thing over here, but we've had a development impact, they get accused of greenwashing, and that's what we're trying to avoid collectively. So, move us on. We did a bit of work initially, looking at which elements of the BNG metric we could replicate, just as a starting point to then see how far we got. So we had a very basic idea of you could derive a unit value for a habitat, by multiplying factors such as habitat importance, the area of the habitat, maybe within the red line boundary of a project, by the condition of the habitat to get a baseline. Maybe strategic significance of that habitat in that place could be important too. But if you have numbers for those, which you do in the BNG metric, the biodiversity net gain metric, you could derive a value which you could then use as a starting point, as a baseline. And then if you deviate from that value through development, you add or you lose units. And that's what you need to make up for, potentially, with your gain delivery. I had a workshop around that. I think it's fair to say the BNG metric has been stung, I think, a little bit, certainly for marine stakeholders, because they were brought in very late, because the policy was rolled out at the 11th hour to encompass intertidal habitat. So they were very late to the net gain party, if you like. So this idea of working out units for habitats and trying to make up for that through habitat delivery was quite a novel concept as compared to on land with the likes of housing developers and road builders and what have you. So we had a workshop. It was very open. They put their BNG metric differences aside, I think it's fair to say. But it was very clear from that the divergence of opinion across the marine sector was huge, from those saying that this is way too simplistic, it's way too discriminatory, it doesn't get you the answer you want, to those saying it's so complicated, this metric, I can't get my head around it. So we went back to the drawing board to look at a much wider review of frameworks. We've got HMC doing a fantastic job with ERM working on this project. This is a bit out of date now, but essentially it's the schematic of how the project's working. I think I need to do an update version of this now, though things have moved on. So we've got a desk-based review, which is now complete, looking at everything. So do you need to focus on habitats and species, or should you be looking much more widely at other framework options? Should you just have a basic levy to say, let's just pay into a fund and we'll do something with that money, and everything in between? That review is now complete. We're now moving into the next phase, which is working up some examples to put some of the frameworks that have been developed through stage one through some development scenarios and some potential gain scenarios. And then the idea is we're going to take that to the sector, across everything, NGOs, academics, to say, what do you think? Is delivering an area of seagrass a gain over loss of a sandbank? Yes or no? If not, why not? That kind of conversation. So that's where we're getting to now. This is where we are as of, I think, 2 weeks ago with the project. We now have a prism, I think that's the word that you've used in the past, Dickon, of looking from the feature-based approach to assessing and comparing losses and gains, so species and habitats, right up through ecosystem functionality and even up to natural capital. So we need to complete the technical advisory group. Hopefully some of you have had some invitations to join that group. And that is to work up these scenarios, this evidence that we can then take to the wider sector and have that conversation, and then run some of those scenarios through those frameworks. And I think that is it. So scan the code. You should be able to scan it from your seats. There's a lot more information on all of those projects. It explains it far better than I just have. And if you want to sign up to the newsletter, there's a lot going on NetGain, particularly around our projects. Then do get in touch. Thank you.